So now we're going to talk about instruction. So I'm going to talk about them in an order. It doesn't matter which order we go in. I am concerned that people see our work. Nancy and I drew these in 2001. I think sometimes people see these and think we mean that you must always start with focus, then go guided, then go collaborative, then go independent. You can do them in any order that makes sense on a given day. You can imagine a class starting where it's independent learning first. The kids walk in, they do a journal entry, do now problem, must do, any of those kinds of right now independent work. You could imagine starting a class with collaborative learning. They have to learn something, they do something together. So you can start anywhere. I do believe that all four of these components must be present in every lesson every day for learning to occur. I don't think you can skip some on some days. I don't think you can say, well, today we're going to do these two and tomorrow we'll do the next two. I think it creates a whole cycle of learning when you do all four of these things each day. So if you take your folds and you look at focused instruction or focused lesson, here's what I think about when I think of focused instruction, that aspect. Number one, there's a purpose. Number two, there's teacher modeling. So first, the purpose. I didn't say objective or learning target, although I could have. I said purpose because I want to make sure we also include relevance. Objectives don't have to be relevant or interesting. You know that, right? We've seen really boring objectives that meet the definition of objective. So we say purpose to make sure that we have an objective that is interesting or relevant to the students. For those of you who have administrative jobs, I wish we could change the teacher job description. And I wish it said that part of your job as a teacher was to make your content interesting and relevant to students. I really believe that a huge part of my paycheck comes because I have to figure out, because I'm paid to figure out how to make my content interesting and relevant for students. That's a huge part of my job. So I say purpose rather than objective or learning target, so that it reminds me to think about the relevance for the learner. The second part of focused instruction is about teacher modeling. Opening up your brain and modeling your thinking, how you solve problems, how you read, how you think about a process, any of those kinds of things, teacher modeling. For me, teacher modeling has, at the very minimum, two components. Number one, it is I statements. It's not we statements, and it's not you statements, it's I statements. When I read this, I was thinking about. When I saw that problem, the first thing I thought of was, it's I statements. The second part of teacher modeling for me is about metacognition, thinking about our thinking. At the very minimum, we should have a because or why or how. I can make the following prediction, blah, 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 because the author told me X. So that's for me modeling. So we have a purpose to every lesson, objective, learning target, whatever, a purpose to every lesson, and we model our thinking. For those of you who are in science and things like, some of those more discovery inquiry fields, you don't like that to come first, right? You don't want to give away a lot of stuff up front. So do the modeling later. It doesn't have to start the lesson. But somewhere in a lesson, I believe that students need to hear some expert thinking from their teachers. Because hopefully, you know more than the majority of students in your class. And sometimes they need to hear that thinking. So that's focused instruction, purpose and modeling. Guided instruction, one example of guided instruction is close reading, which we talked about this morning. The other way to do it is to prompt and cue and question students. So for us, our definition of guided instruction is the strategic use of questions, prompts, and cues. I'll say that one more time. The strategic use of questions, prompts, and cues. This was a weakness I had as a teacher. I was pretty good at whole class instruction, modeling, setting my purpose, and I'm pretty good at getting groups of students to work collaboratively. And then if I noticed a group was struggling, I would go over to that group and I would re-explain to them what I just told the whole class. Do you hear that I'm doing all the work still? This was hard for me because I know how to like listen to them, and when they struggle, I know how to take it back, take over, and give them more information. So I've had to learn to not do that, to not tell the students the information they're missing, but rather ask a question, prompt them, or cue them. It's a little slower, but it's the students doing the cognitive work. So I think there's two ways to do guided instruction if we're in that area. If the students are working in a group, you can, as a teacher, insert yourself into the group and switch it from group work to guided instruction because of your presence. Or you can take students out of different groups and pull them to you for a small group lesson, an extension, a remediation, something like that. So we have two ways of thinking about guided instruction in the small group format. You rotate around, which you're going to see in a video clip in a little bit, or pulling kids from their groups and doing some instruction. So every day, teachers should be working on the errors and misconceptions that students have and trying not to just tell them something, but to prompt and cue them. I think that's fair, don't you? That'd be a reasonable part of school. Every day we should have students doing collaborative learning. So if you could move to that part of your notes. And for me, collaborative learning is student-to-student interaction. They talk to each other. They interact. They interact in academic ways, with academic language. I assume many of you work in schools that have numbers of English learners. And I assume many of your English learners speak Spanish. And do you all speak Spanish? Why don't you speak Spanish? If it were easy to learn a language from listening to a language, you would all be fluent in Spanish. Because you all hear Spanish enough. Or pick another language. You hear a lot of languages enough. No one learns language from listening to language. We learn language from producing language. What we have to do is make sure kids spend a large percentage of their day producing language. The language of instruction. So if I'm teaching in academic English, they should be using it. If I'm teaching in Spanish, they should be using it. We have to get students producing the language for them to learn the language. That's the whole point of collaborative learning, is building academic language. And some of you work in schools where there aren't a lot of English learners. But do your students speak the discipline of science, or the discipline of mathematics, or the discipline of history, or the discipline of art? If not, they need to apprentice to that. So we need more time in school with student-to-student interaction. We did a year of professional development all on collaborative learning. And I would be willing to bet that year, at the end of the year, you could have come to any of the 45 schools and talked to just about any teacher. And you would have heard, here's what collaborative learning is, here's why it's important, and here are 3 instructional routines to get kids working. We had amazing increases in levels of knowledge. And then I would also be willing to bet that year that if you went to the classroom of that teacher you were talking to, you would not see collaborative learning. High levels of knowledge, low levels of implementation. So we did another year of PD, and we took people, we asked people to come to the district office for interviews and focus groups. And over and over and over we said, you know a lot about collaborative learning, you know a lot about interaction, why isn't it happening at your school? We didn't say personally, you said at your school. The 2 most common reasons I think are fascinating. Number 1, the teachers will almost always say, my principal expects a quiet classroom. So if you are a principal, vice principal, district leader in here, put out a memo. I do not expect a quiet classroom. I also don't expect chaos and cocktail parties, right? I don't know, right? But somewhere in between that, right? In fact, there is an app available for a smartphone from a company. I noticed they weren't here today. But most of the conferences I go to that have administrators present, they sell this app for your smartphone that's a teacher observation tool. The very first thing on the app that the principal has to click on says that the classroom was quiet and orderly. That's not what I'm looking for. In fact, if I checked that, I'd be disappointed. But that app, that classroom observation app for sale for your smartphone, is trying to privilege quiet and orderly classrooms. And for me, there's not enough language going on if that's checked off. The second reason, which I think is the true reason, that the teacher said they didn't use collaborative learning was around their own experience in school. They all would talk about, nearly every teacher in those focus groups and interviews talked about an experience when they were in school where they did group work and they did all the work for the group. So it got me thinking, schools are filled with good boys and girls from school. That's you all, right? Almost all of you in this room were the good boys and girls in school. School worked for you. After all, you decided to spend the rest of your life in school. Right? I mean, you're in school all the time. So it worked for you. There are some of your peers who went to school with you who cannot imagine spending one more day. They often have children who go to our school and they can't imagine going back to school, and when you ask for parent involvement, they're like, I am never going to that third grade classroom again. So that's part of our issue around parent involvement. That's another topic. So we had these stories of teachers saying, when I was in blank grade, my teacher did group work, and I did all the work for the group. Because grown-ups in school, you all, are the good boys and girls in school. And fast forward 30 years later, you're bitter about that. And you don't want to do to your students what your teachers did to you. Because you did the work and everybody else got the grade. Some of you will recognize that, right? You can think back to a specific time in a specific class where you did all the work for the group and the other members got the grade. That happens a lot in college, by the way. The divide and conquer. You do this part, you do this part, you do this part, and two of your members don't do anything, so you have to do it all so you can get the grade to pass because you care about it. So we talked a lot about that in collaborative learning, we better start building some individual accountability. Because if we don't, we end up recreating the things we didn't like about school. So we're going to talk a lot about individual accountability and how to build that into the collaborative learning. Because without it, we are very much at risk of one kid doing all the work and all the talking and no one else doing anything. And that's a waste of time. The last one, independent learning. That's the application of the things we've been teaching students. If I could do this over, I would divide that into two halves. I think there's in-class independent learning and out-of-class independent learning. Overall, as a profession, I think we're pretty good at in-class independent learning. Do you agree with that? Quizzes, bell work, journal writing, do now, those kinds of things. I think we're pretty good at that. I don't think we're very good at out-of-class independent learning, homework. I think we give homework prematurely in the instructional cycle. If I just taught you how to calculate slope, tonight's not a good night for 15 odd-numbered problems on slope. Do you recognize that? So we give kids this homework. We call it instant application homework. I just taught you this, now take it home and do it. So this is my dream, my vision, my hope for what schools would look like. There's a purpose every day. The teachers model every day. Students have time to work together using academic language in the presence of their peers. Teachers notice errors and misconceptions, and they don't tell the kid the information. They use questions, prompts, and cues. And they hold students accountable for that information through a spiral review practice. It doesn't sound too hard, does it? Not a big, long list. It's not brain surgery or rocket science. Here's a list of things that we know work to change achievement.